A disabled boy sat shivering in his wheelchair, clutching a hand-drawn ticket like it was his last hope. A station attendant tore it in half, shoved him to the ground, and the crowd looked away, afraid to get involved. But before the train even arrived, a man stepped off the carriage with a blind German shepherd at his side, lifted the boy's tattered backpack, and asked in a voice that cut through the fog, "Did you just push a disabled child over a piece of paper?" The morning fog lay heavy over Redwood Junction, swallowing the narrow main street of this quiet mountain town in Colorado. The air smelled faintly of pine and coal dust, the legacy of a place that had once thrived on logging and mining. The sky was a pale, winter-white curtain, with the early sun struggling to push its way through. At the far end of town, the train station stood like an old sentinel, red brick walls, an arched roof blackened by decades of smoke, and a platform slick with dew. The station clock ticked loudly in the silence between train whistles, its hands moving slower than the cold breath of the morning. Charlie Dawson sat at the edge of the platform, his small frame swallowed by a faded navy sweater, 2 sizes too big. At 9 years old, he had the gaunt build of a child who had learned hunger early in life. His brown hair stuck up in uneven tufts as if cut by impatient hands, and a faint scar curved along his jaw. An old injury from when his wheelchair had tipped over years ago. Charlie's eyes were a quiet blue, the kind that didn't beg for attention, but soaked in every detail, every movement. He clutched a worn canvas backpack with a torn strap in his lap, and, in his left hand, a folded piece of paper. The train ticket he had drawn himself the night before, using a borrowed pencil from the orphanage. He had never seen a real ticket up close, but he remembered his mother holding one like it the last time she took him on a train. That was before the accident, before everything changed. As he waited, a sound of boots echoed from behind. Gary Holt, the station attendant, approached with a measured pace that carried more authority than kindness. Gary was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with thinning gray hair combed back so tightly it looked wet. His face was weathered, but not by hardship, by habit, the kind of habit that came from always being in charge and never being questioned. His deep-set eyes, slightly bloodshot from a morning cigarette, had a permanent squint that made him seem both watchful and weary. Gary was known among locals as a man who did things by the book, but was quicker to follow rules against the vulnerable than for them. Years of working the platform had hardened him. Years before, his wife had left without warning, taking their son, and bitterness had slowly filled the cracks she left behind. Gary stopped in front of Charlie, his shadow spilling over the boy. "What's this?" he asked, bending down to snatch the folded paper from Charlie's small hand. Charlie's voice came out thin, shaky. I have a ticket. I just want to get on the train." Gary unfolded the paper, squinting at the hand-drawn lines and crooked letters. Then came a low, humorless laugh. "A ticket? This?" Without hesitation, he tore the paper in half and let the pieces fall to the cement. The sound of the tears seemed louder than the distant rumble of the approaching train. "You shouldn't be here, kid. This place isn't for you." Before Charlie could react, Gary moved behind the wheelchair, gripped the handles, and shoved it toward the edge of the platform. The front wheel caught on a crack in the concrete, and the chair tilted violently. Charlie tumbled forward, hitting the ground hard on his left knee. Pain shot through him, but he didn't scream. He only curled around his leg, trembling, a small whimper escaping his lips. A few onlookers glanced their way. One man started forward but stopped, then turned away. A mother covered her daughter's eyes. No one spoke. It was at that moment the first car of the train slid to a stop, its brakes hissing. From the open door stepped a man in a long charcoal wool coat. His hat, a broad-brimmed gray fedora, pulled low against the cold. In his right hand, he carried a brown leather suitcase. In his left, a leash attached to a German shepherd. The dog's fur was a blend of sable and black, its muzzle touched with early silver. Around his head was tied a neatly knotted orange blindfold, the color vivid even in the fog. This was Rusty, 6 years old, once a top search and rescue dog before an accident in the field had taken his sight. Despite his blindness, Rusty held himself tall and alert, his ears flicking at every sound, his nose catching scents most people would never notice. Where his eyes had once met the world directly, now his trust came entirely from the voices and footsteps around him. The man holding his leash was Ethan Cross. At 48, Ethan's height and broad build still carried traces of his youth, working in the coal pits alongside his father. His hair, dark with strands of silver at the temples, was combed neatly despite the long journey. His face was strong-lined, but softened by deep-set eyes of stormy gray, eyes that had learned to hide more than they revealed. Once a miner, Ethan had risen through grit and relentless work to become the owner of Cross-Continental Logistics, one of the country's most influential freight companies. But success hadn't filled the empty chair at his family table. 5 years ago, his only niece had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and he'd been searching ever since. It was this personal quest that had brought him to Redwood Junction that morning. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, but carrying through the air like the strike of a bell. "Did you just push a disabled child over a piece of paper?" The question cut through the silence. Gary turned to face him, eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He set his suitcase down beside Charlie, then crouched, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Charlie shook his head faintly, but avoided eye contact. Rusty took a step forward, lowering his head until his cold nose brushed against Charlie's sleeve, as if mapping out the boy's shape in the fog. Only then did Ethan look up at Gary, his gaze sharp as steel. "Rules are one thing," he said evenly, "but cruelty is another. You had no right." Gary's jaw tightened. "No ticket, no train. I'm doing my job." "Your job," Ethan replied, "doesn't require you to injure a child." He rose to his full height, picking up the torn backpack from the ground and placing it gently back in Charlie's lap. "You should step away now." The weight in his voice wasn't loud, but it was the kind that made men move. Gary hesitated, then took a small step back, muttering something under his breath. Ethan turned his attention back to Charlie. "Come on," he said softly, taking hold of the wheelchair handles while Rusty walked faithfully at his side. They began moving away from the platform toward the station's main hall. Passengers who had been silent now murmured in low tones, but no one stopped them. As they crossed the tiled walkway, Charlie looked up for the first time. "Who are you, mister?" Ethan's answer was quiet, almost lost to the clatter of the departing train. "Just someone who can't stand to see a kid treated like trash." Charlie didn't fully understand, but he noticed the man's hand was warm on the back of his chair, and that warmth felt like something he hadn't known in a very long time. What Charlie didn't know was that Ethan's trip to Redwood Junction wasn't only for business. In his inner coat pocket was a folded letter from a private investigator, the latest in a long trail of leads pointing toward his missing niece. Somewhere in this small town, perhaps even in the same orphanage Charlie had come from, was the girl he had been searching for across 5 years and countless miles. And now, with Rusty's ears twitching at every sound and Charlie's gaze fixed ahead, Ethan knew his day had already changed. What began as a hunt for one lost child had just grown into something larger, a promise, unspoken but already binding. But the diner stood at the corner of Main Street, its neon sign flickering in the fog like a heartbeat. Redwood Junction Cafe had been serving the town for decades, the scent of bacon and fresh coffee spilling into the street even on the coldest mornings. Inside, the walls were lined with framed photographs of steam locomotives, snow-capped mountains, and faces of regulars who had long since passed. The air was warm, carrying the comforting hum of a coffee pot and the low chatter of locals. Ethan pushed Charlie's wheelchair through the door, Rusty padding closely beside them, his orange blindfold bright against the muted tones of the room. The dog's ears swiveled at every sound, the clink of plates, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of a coat, as though he was mapping the room through noise alone. Charlie sat stiffly in the chair, his gaze lowered, one hand clutching the backpack that had been returned to him. Behind the counter stood Martha Green, the cafe's owner. Martha was in her late 60s, a stout woman with short silver hair and a face that seemed carved from both kindness and stubborn resolve. Her hazel eyes held the weight of someone who had seen people at their worst and still chosen to believe in the good. Once, many years ago, she'd lost her own son to a logging accident, and the grief had reshaped her. She'd become the kind of woman who noticed the quiet pain in others, even when they tried to hide it. "Mornin', Ethan," Martha greeted, her voice a blend of warmth and curiosity. "Haven't seen you in town for years. Who's your friend?" Her gaze dropped to Charlie, then softened even more. "This is Charlie," Ethan said, steering the wheelchair toward a booth near the window. He took a fall at the station. "Could we get some warm tea and maybe a first aid kit?" Martha nodded without a word and disappeared into the kitchen. Rusty lay down beside the booth, his head resting lightly against Charlie's foot. Charlie looked down at the dog and tentatively reached to scratch behind his ear. Rusty's tail thumped once against the floor. Martha returned with a tray, a steaming mug of chamomile tea, a plate with toast and jam, and a small tin box of bandages and antiseptic wipes. "Here you go," she said, setting the tea in front of Charlie. "And don't even think about paying for this, Ethan. My treat." As Ethan cleaned the scrape on Charlie's knee, he spoke gently. "That man at the station, has he treated you like that before?" Charlie hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. "No, I don't really go there. Not since—" He stopped, staring at the steam curling from the tea. "Not since my parents died." Ethan's hands paused. "What happened?" Charlie swallowed hard. 7 years ago, there was a train. It went off the tracks. My mom and dad were on it. They said it was an accident, but—" His voice wavered. "One of the older boys at the orphanage told me the tracks were bad for a long time. Someone didn't fix them because it cost too much." The words hit Ethan like the dull echo of a hammer on steel. He knew that line, knew the year, the reports, the ignored recommendations. Back then, Cross-Continental Logistics had been preparing to sell one of its southern divisions. The maintenance delays had been signed off by regional managers under his leadership. He had told himself at the time it was business, not negligence. But now, staring at this boy, he wondered if that decision had been written in the blood of people like Charlie's parents. Before Ethan could respond, the bell above the door jingled. Rusty's head shot up, ears pricking sharply. A familiar heavy tread approached, the faint jangle of keys, the smell of cigarette smoke. Gary Holt stepped into the cafe, his uniform jacket zipped to the chin. Rusty stood, muscles tensing, and let out a low growl in Gary's direction. His blindfold didn't hide the way his head turned to track the sound of each step. Gary's eyes met Ethan's across the room, narrowing. "Didn't expect to see you here." He glanced down at Charlie, then back to Ethan. "That kid still hanging around? Better keep him away from the station. Rules are rules." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. "Maybe the rules need changing," he said evenly. Rusty's growl deepened until Gary scoffed and turned toward the counter, muttering under his breath. Charlie's shoulders were tense, but Ethan placed a steady hand on them. "Ignore him," he said quietly. "We've got other things to focus on." After Gary left with his coffee to go, Ethan leaned forward. "Charlie, you said you're at the Maple Grove orphanage, right?" Charlie nodded. "Been there since the accident? Why?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I've been looking for someone. My niece. She went missing 5 years ago. Last I heard, she might be in this area. I didn't know until today that the orphanage you're from is here in Redwood Junction." Charlie's eyes flickered with something. Curiosity, maybe even recognition. But he said nothing. Ethan let it go for now. He knew pressing too hard might close doors before they were even open. Martha came by to refill Ethan's coffee. "Maple Grove, huh? My sister used to volunteer there before she moved. Rough place sometimes, underfunded, but the kids, they're good kids." She looked at Charlie with a small smile. "This one's got a quiet strength. Reminds me of my boy." When they stepped back out into the fog, Rusty took the lead, his nose to the wind as if pulling them towards something unseen. Ethan adjusted his coat collar against the cold, the letter from his investigator burning a weight in his pocket. The path to finding his niece had just twisted in a new direction, one that now wound through the life of this boy who had already lost so much. And somewhere behind the silence of the mountains, Ethan felt old wounds stirring, both his and the town's. The road to Maple Grove Orphanage wound through the outskirts of Redwood Junction, where the pines grew denser and the fog clung low to the ground like a restless ghost. The building appeared through the mist, a large, weathered structure of pale clapboard, its roof patched in several places, the once white paint peeling to reveal gray wood beneath. A narrow gravel path led to the front porch, where the railing leaned slightly, as if tired from years of holding on. Ethan pushed Charlie's wheelchair up the path, Rusty walking on his left, nose twitching as he took in the scents of damp soil, old wood, and the faint traces of cooking drifting from inside. The dog's orange blindfold caught a stray beam of sunlight that pierced the fog, making it glow faintly against the muted landscape. The front door opened before they could knock. Mrs. Helen Carter stepped out, her hand resting lightly on the frame. Helen was in her mid-50s, tall and angular, with hair the color of pewter pulled into a low bun. Her face was narrow, with sharp cheekbones softened by lines that spoke of both laughter and worry. She wore a dark green cardigan over a plain beige dress, her practical shoes planted firmly on the porch. Helen's eyes were a clear gray, calm but probing, eyes that could see both the mischief and the hurt in children before a word was spoken. "Mr. Cross, I presume?" she said, her tone formal but not unfriendly. "Charlie, I see you found company." "He's been through a rough morning," Ethan replied. "We just wanted to make sure he got back safe." Helen's gaze shifted to Rusty, and for a moment her expression softened. "And this must be your companion. Beautiful animal." "Rusty," Ethan said, giving the leash a gentle shake. "He's special." Helen nodded, then gestured toward the door. "Come in, we'll talk in my office." Inside, the orphanage smelled faintly of furniture polish and oatmeal. The hallway walls were lined with children's drawings, bright bursts of color against the otherwise muted interior. A few children peeked from a doorway, curious but shy, before darting back out of sight. Helen's office was small but tidy, with shelves of neatly labeled binders and a large window overlooking the back garden. She took her seat behind the desk and folded her hands. "Charlie's been with us for 7 years, she began. "He's quiet, keeps to himself, but the other children like him. He did have a close bond with one boy, Ben." Charlie looked up at the mention of the name. "Ben's my brother," he said softly. Helen inclined her head. "Not by blood, but close enough. They came to us within months of each other, and they've been inseparable since. Unfortunately, Ben's paperwork for adoption has just been finalized. He'll be leaving for Montana in a few days." Charlie's face paled. "Nobody told me." Helen's voice softened. "We were waiting for the right time." Ethan kept his gaze steady on Helen. "Can I meet Ben?" "Of course," Helen said, rising. "He's in the playroom." They found Ben near the back, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with a half-built model train in front of him. Ben was about 11, with sandy blonde hair and a scattering of freckles across his nose. His green eyes were bright, though they carried the wariness of a child used to changes he couldn't control. He looked up when Charlie rolled in, and a grin broke across his face. "Charlie!" Ben scrambled to his feet, closing the distance in a few strides. He knelt beside the wheelchair, gripping Charlie's shoulder in a way that spoke of shared years and unspoken promises. While the boys talked quietly, Rusty began to pace. His ears twitched as if catching a faint sound, his nose working the air. Then, without warning, he trotted toward the glass door leading to the garden and pawed at it. Ethan followed his lead. "Mind if we step outside?" he asked Helen. "Go ahead," she said. The garden behind the orphanage was simple: patches of vegetables, a small apple tree, and a worn bench under a maple whose leaves were beginning to turn. Rusty moved with purpose, guiding Charlie's wheelchair down the narrow path. Near the base of the apple tree, he stopped, lowered his head, and began to sniff the ground intently. His paw scraped against something buried just beneath the soil. Ethan crouched, brushing away the dirt until a small object emerged, a tarnished silver necklace with a delicate oval pendant. He turned it over in his palm, and the engraving caught the light. Lily. The name hit him like a sudden gust of wind. His niece's name. Ethan straightened slowly, the pendant still in his hand. "Charlie, do you know whose this is?" Charlie shook his head. "Number, I've never seen it before." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He could see the flicker in the boy's eyes, recognition, or at least familiarity, but also a reluctance to speak. He knew better than to press too hard. Helen stepped out onto the porch, her voice carrying across the garden. "Mr. Cross, is everything all right?" Ethan slipped the necklace into his coat pocket before turning. "Yes, just curious about the garden." As they walked back inside, Ethan's mind was already racing. If this pendant belonged to Lily, then she had been here at some point, possibly even lived here. That meant the threads of his search and Charlie's life were more intertwined than he had imagined. And now he knew exactly what he had to do. Dig deeper into the orphanage's past, into the records, the comings and goings of every child in the last 5 years. Somewhere in those pages, he was certain, lay the truth about Lily, and perhaps about why fate had put Charlie Dawson in his path. The boardroom at Redwood Junction station was not built for spectacle. It was a narrow space with pale yellow walls, a long walnut table, and a single row of tall windows that looked out onto the fog-draped tracks. But that morning, the room was full, station management in press suits, a handful of journalists with cameras and notepads, and several townspeople who had come to see why a meeting had been called so suddenly. The air buzzed with low whispers and the occasional snap of a camera shutter. Ethan Cross stood at one end of the table, his charcoal coat open, Rusty sitting at his right side like a sentinel. Rusty's orange blindfold was impossible to miss, and his steady posture drew almost as much attention as Ethan's presence. Ethan's gray eyes scanned the room, locking briefly with Gary Holt, who sat at the opposite end in a crisp uniform and an expression that hovered between defiance and calculation. At the head of the table was Samuel Price, the station's general manager. Price was in his early 60s, a tall, narrow man with thinning sandy hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of adjusting his tie whenever conversation grew tense. He had the careful politeness of someone used to smoothing over conflicts before they reached the newspapers, but his eyes betrayed a nervous flicker every time they landed on Ethan. Ethan began without preamble. "You've all seen the footage by now," he said, sliding a tablet across the table toward the journalists. "This is Gary Holt shoving a disabled child from his wheelchair and destroying his only ticket, a ticket he'd drawn himself. This isn't about a rule being broken. It's about a system that allows cruelty under the pretense of procedure." Murmurs moved through the room as the video looped on the tablet screens. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I'm proposing an overhaul to the station's ticketing policy. From this point forward, all orphans, the disabled, and homeless individuals will have the right to travel free of charge, with assistance provided for boarding and seating." Gary's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You give out free rides to every stray kid and vagrant, you'll have this place crawling with troublemakers. The station will be a dumping ground." Before Ethan could reply, Rusty rose to his feet. His ears angled sharply toward Gary, and he let out a low, sharp bark that carried across the room like a warning. The sound cut through the rising voices, freezing them in place. A woman in the crowd turned toward Gary, her brow furrowed. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and a green wool coat buttoned to her chin. "I know you," she said suddenly. "Last winter, you threw me and my father out of this station because our ticket was crumpled and wet from the snow. My father could barely walk, and you didn't care." Her voice trembled, but it was enough. Another man spoke up from the back, adding his own story. Soon the air was thick with accounts of Gary's past actions, stories that had never been recorded, but had clearly never been forgotten. Price raised his hands, trying to regain order, but the momentum had shifted. The journalists were scribbling furiously, some recording the scene on their phones. Ethan waited until the noise subsided, then spoke again. "This isn't one man's fault alone. This is what happens when an organization forgets its purpose. This station should be a gateway for people, not a barrier." The room was quiet, the only sound the distant rumble of a departing freight train. Price cleared his throat. "We'll take your proposal under consideration, Mr. Cross. And as for the matter of Mr. Holt, the board will review the complaints." Ethan didn't smile, but his gaze held firm. "I'll expect a decision within the week." As the meeting broke apart, Ethan stepped into the corridor, Rusty walking at his heel. Waiting there was Clara Jennings, a young clerk from the town records office. Clara was in her late 20s, short and slight, with auburn hair tucked under a knitted beret and a face that always seemed to be holding back a knowing smile. She handed Ethan a slim folder. "You asked for anything we had on a Lily Cross," she said softly. "This is all I could find, but you should read it somewhere private." Ethan thanked her and slipped the folder into his coat. Later, in the quiet of his hotel room, he sat by the window and opened it. Inside were photocopied records from a local hospital and the orphanage. Lily Cross, age 10, admitted 5 years ago after a train accident. Head injury, memory loss, no surviving parents. She had been placed in Maple Grove Orphanage but transferred to another facility 6 months later. Ethan's grip on the paper tightened. The dates matched. The accident matched. It wasn't just a lead, it was confirmation. She was alive, but the girl he'd been searching for didn't remember him, didn't remember her life before the crash. Rusty patted over, resting his head on Ethan's knee. The weight was grounding, a silent reminder that even the lost could find their way back, sometimes by scent, sometimes by instinct, sometimes by the pull of family. Ethan looked out toward the darkened tracks, the fog curling through the lamplight. The battle at Redwood Junction wasn't over, but he had won the first round, and now, with Lily's file in his hands, he knew the next fight would be even more personal. The courtroom was modest, with sunlight spilling through tall windows onto polished oak benches. The hearing had stretched over 3 days, but the verdict came swiftly on the 4th. The panel of station board members and regional railway officials delivered their decision with the measured tone of people who had argued long behind closed doors. Gary Holt was to be terminated from his position, effective immediately. His record of repeated misconduct, corroborated by witness testimonies and recent video evidence, left no ground for appeal. Ethan Cross sat in the front row, Rusty at his feet. The German shepherd's ears twitched at the collective murmur that followed the announcement, but his posture remained calm, the orange blindfold bright in the golden morning light. Ethan allowed himself only the smallest exhale, a release of tension rather than celebration. The real victory was not Gary's dismissal, but what would follow. 2 weeks later, Redwood Junction station looked almost unrecognizable. The cracked tiles of the platform had been replaced with smooth, pale stone. Benches, once splintered and faded, now gleamed with fresh varnish. Wide ramps were installed beside the stairs, handrails polished, and clear signage posted in bold lettering. At the center of the station's main hall stood a new bronze plaque, mounted on a stone pedestal, its engraved letters catching the light. Everyone has a place on this journey. The plaque was the public face of the Little Passenger Fund, a program Ethan had spearheaded to provide free train travel for orphans, the disabled, and the homeless. The fund covered not only tickets but also assistance in boarding, travel companions for those in need, and priority seating. Behind the desk at the new Assistance and Care booth was Margaret Maggie Fields, a retired nurse in her late 60s, with a crown of curly white hair and a pair of half-moon glasses always perched at the end of her nose. Maggie's warmth was immediate, her voice carrying the no-nonsense kindness of someone who had spent decades caring for people when no one else would. She had joined the station staff after reading about Ethan's reforms in the newspaper, saying, "If you're building a station for everyone, you'll need someone who knows what everyone really means." Rusty had become something of a celebrity. His image, orange blindfold and all, was printed on the station's flyers promoting the Little Passenger Fund. Travelers often paused to greet him, and children reached out small hands to stroke his fur. Rusty accepted the attention with quiet dignity, his tail giving a single wag for each gentle touch. The day Ethan had been waiting for arrived in early autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of apples from the nearby orchards. That morning, Lily stood beside him on the platform. She was 12 now, her hair a soft chestnut that framed a face both familiar and changed. Her eyes, hazel like her mother's, held a question in them whenever she looked at Ethan, as though she were still trying to place the pieces of the man who claimed to be her uncle. Memory loss had left her without the threads of their shared past, but Ethan knew that time could weave new ones. Beside Lily were Charlie and Ben, dressed in fresh clothes chosen for the occasion. Charlie's wheelchair gleamed with new wheels, the seat fitted to his frame. Ben, a little taller than the last time Ethan had seen him, stood with a protective hand on Charlie's shoulder. They had been officially placed under Ethan's guardianship the week before, the paperwork finalized without contest. The station was alive with activity. A group of children from Maple Grove Orphanage, along with their caretakers, waited in a cheerful cluster for the day's train to Denver, the first trip under the Little Passenger Fund's banner. Rusty moved easily among them, pausing to sniff each child in greeting, his body relaxed but attentive. Ethan glanced down at Charlie. "You've got your ticket?" Charlie grinned, holding it up. It was a real train ticket, stamped and validated. But in the lower corner, he had drawn a small, careful sketch of Rusty's orange blindfold. "Just to make sure they know who I'm traveling with," he said. The whistle of the approaching train cut through the morning air. Steam curled along the platform as the engine slowed, the metallic screech of the brakes echoing between the station walls. Children clutched their bags a little tighter, eyes wide with excitement. Maggie moved along the group, checking names and making sure everyone had what they needed. Ethan crouched beside Lily. "You don't have to remember everything for it to matter," he told her quietly. "We start from here, okay?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod, her fingers brushing his before she stepped toward the carriage with the others. Rusty stood at Ethan's side, his head tilted toward the sound of the boarding calls. When Charlie rolled forward, Rusty walked just close enough for his shoulder to touch the side of the wheelchair. Ben fell into step on the other side, the three of them moving together as though connected by an invisible thread. When the last child was aboard, Ethan stepped back, watching from the platform as the conductor, Peter Lang, a sturdy man in his 50s with a booming voice and a salt and pepper beard, gave the final signal. The train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed. Charlie leaned toward the window, holding up his ticket so Ethan could see the little orange sketch. Ben grinned beside him. Lily sat just behind them, her face half in shadow. But Ethan caught the faintest smile. The bronze plaque glinted in the sunlight as the train disappeared down the track. Ethan rested his hand on Rusty's back. "Looks like everyone's found their place," he murmured. Rusty's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, it felt like the station itself was breathing easier. In the quiet rhythm of trains coming and going, we are reminded that life, too, is a journey. Some travelers board with joy, others with loss, but no one should ever be left standing alone on the platform. What happened at Redwood Junction was more than policy change or a victory in the court. It was a glimpse of what can happen when compassion meets courage. I believe that was a miracle, the kind that God plants in ordinary days, through ordinary people willing to stand up for what is right. In our daily lives, we may never lead a courtroom battle or rebuild a train station, but we can still open doors for those who have been shut out, speak up for those who have been silenced, and offer a hand to someone struggling to move forward. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and subscribe for more true stories that remind us we are never too far from grace. May God bless each of you watching, and if you believe every person has a place on this journey, write Amen in the comments.